There's a lot of people that we could recognize during this documentary. Sarah Stone Libby is one of them. She's the only woman that signed the official letter to Massachusetts requesting that Machias become a township. She was a widow, and as I said, the only woman out of 80 people to sign the letter. There's a story to be told there. Eventually, we'd like to cover each of these stories, but for now, we only have a little limited amount of time and resources. Another interesting person that we could talk about would be Benedict Arnold. We know he traveled the Kennebec River in western Massachusetts, present-day Maine, with bateaus and such. Very few people realize that he spent a considerable amount of time in this region. He owned a storehouse on Campobello Island, and he had ships where he traded up and down the coast. He had a storehouse in St. John. We know he did business in this area, and he attempted to transport a house down the coast, but weather forced him ashore near Machias at Englishman's River, and there's a house there today that Benedict Arnold brought ashore and placed on a hill overlooking the mouth of Englishman's River. Another very interesting person whose story should be told would be Obadiah Hill. The Hill brothers were some of the very first settlers of Machias. They also helped settle Calais at the mouth of the St. Croix River. Obadiah Hill was a log driver, a woodsman, and he was true to the American patriotic cause. He participated in capturing the Margaretta in June of 1775. He drowned just 3 years after the Revolutionary War in 1786 at Holmes Falls on the Machias River during a log drive. It's a considerable distance from the village of Machias, many miles upriver. It wasn't practical to transport his body back to Machias, so the men buried him in a pork barrel on an island there at Holmes Falls. His son, named after him, was born shortly after his death. His son built a house at the corner of Broadway and High Street, and that house still stands today as a memory of these early people of Machias. And that son, who was also named Obadiah Hill, built 4 houses along High Street, one for each of his children, and he built them as similar as possible so that each child would have about the same type of house, same floor plan. And those houses also still stand today. So there's a lot of rich history still available in Machias that gives a window into the past. One person that we do need to take time to recognize is Dr. William Chaloner. Like many of the people that we are learning about and trying to recognize, there's been misinformation passed down through time, which is very typical. A lot of people think that the first time Dr. William Chaloner arrived in Machias was when they sent for him after the Battle of Machias to come treat the wounded from the Battle of the Margaretta. Actually, he arrived in Machias 2 years prior to that, in 1773. In 1774, he was still in Machias, and he purchased 7 acres of land in April. That land was on Broadway. And later that year, in 1774, he married his wife in Machias, and her name was Mary. Mary and William eventually were buried over in East Falls behind the church, the same cemetery that Colonel Benjamin Foster is buried in. William Chaloner liked to return to Nova Scotia to visit, and that's where he was when the 1775 Battle of Machias occurred. When the battle was over and the people of Machias realized that there were men on both sides that were severely wounded, they knew they needed a doctor. They sent a ship across Fundy Bay to Nova Scotia, and when the ship returned, Dr. William Chaloner was on the ship. He treated the men on both sides with equal skill as a very valuable surgeon. He later was recognized by both countries for treating the wounded after that battle. Rev James Lyons had been in Machias a few years and was acquainted with the doctor, and they both knew that there were many people who had moved from New England to Nova Scotia, and a lot of those people were sympathetic to the American patriotic cause, and they felt that if they could go to Nova Scotia and help organize those people, they could win Nova Scotia as the 14th colony. Reverend Lyons sent a letter to George Washington telling him that he felt that there was an opportunity to capture Nova Scotia, free it of the British rule, and make it part of America. George Washington felt that there were few men available and not enough equipment to make such a trip successful at that point. Reverend Lyon, Dr. Chaloner, a local man, William Albee, who was a lieutenant in the militia, who was another story in and of itself, teamed up with Colonel Jonathan Eddy, and they made a plan to travel 200 miles across the ocean to Fort Cumberland in hopes of capturing it and using that to help make Nova Scotia part of the United States. This was in 1776, and one thing that fueled their energy is another little known incident. The British, who were still upset from the Battle of Machias in 1775, where they lost not only the Margaretta, but a month later, they sent the HMS Diligent and the HMS Tatamagouche into this bay in search of the Margaretta. And the people of Machias successfully captured both of those ships. The British were very upset. They returned in July of 1776, July 9th, just 5 days after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This time, they sent the HMS Viper, armed with British. And instead of sailing into the village, which they had now written about, calling it a hornet's nest. They stayed out here in the bay, and they captured 5 unarmed fishing vessels. Those fishing vessels were estimated to be loaded with 10 quintals of fish. 10 quintals, by today's standards, would be 10,000 pounds of fish. That's a lot of fish to feed people in 1776. Food that was very needed to feed the people of Machias. So in December of 1776, these men felt they'd had enough. They wanted to send a message to the British in nearby Nova Scotia. The winter months was probably the worst time they could attempt such a thing, but obviously they felt they had to. Eddie, Albee, Chaloner, other men of Machias sailed to Fort Cumberland. George Washington ended up being correct. The fort was well manned, well armed, and the militia from Machias was forced to retreat back to Machias. They returned to Machias, and shortly after that they met up with Colonel John Allen. John Allen had been forced out of Nova Scotia. His family had been taken captive, and he too wanted to send a message to the people of Nova Scotia. He had been appointed as the liaison between the local Indian tribes. The Wabanaki Confederacy was formed, and in one of the few places along the eastern coastline, the local Indian tribes sided with the American patriots, largely due to Colonel John Allen's treatment and partnership with the Indians. Many Indians came to Machias and defended it that next year in 1777. Had they not come to Machias and participated in the Battle of Machias 1777, the town probably would have been burned flat. After the Battle of 1777, Dr. William Chaloner remained determined to fight for the American freedom. He sailed up and down the coastline with Captain Jeremiah OBrien as a valued surgeon to have on board in the event that there were wounded from battles. In his time with Captain Jeremiah OBrien, we know Captain Jeremiah OBrien ended up captured, imprisoned, sent to England, placed in one of the worst prisons over there, and later successfully escaped and returned back to Machias. Dr. Chaloner was also captured twice during the war. Being a war prisoner during the Revolutionary War was one of the worst things that could happen. The living conditions and lack of food, diseases, was a great opportunity to die a miserable death. A memorial in front of Dr. William Chaloner's home on Broadway in Machias reads, "The first physician who practiced his profession in Machias, and an early leader in the business and social activities of the early settlement. His skillful treatment of the wounded in the engagement of June 1775 won commendations from both sides. In later years of the Revolutionary War, his services were constantly employed on the private armed ships which so effectively aided the American cause. In this service, he was twice made prisoner of war. In 1796 to 1798, he was employed as a surveyor by the committee which determined the eastern boundary of the United States. He was the first master of the Warren Lodge of Freemasons, which was established in 1778. These are just a few of the reasons that we felt that it was important to recognize Dr. William Chaloner as one of the important patriots who helped establish and make Machias a successful township.